And we shall be on the show. Hello, everyone. We really thank you for your participation, for the ones who are active and for the ones who will be watching it maybe later. Also, this is a special moment for us. We've got an esteemed speaker today with us, not always available, but she made herself available thanks to Angela, our moderator of today. And for the ones who don't know, Organization Women International Trade, I'm the international president. And what we stand for is what is OVID? OVID is a global membership organization for women, but also for men. So we're inclusive. And it's in all facets of trade, whether you're in agriculture, in mining, in precious metals, in fashion, in all facets. And it's designed to promote the advancements of women in trade and in business. Could be also services that you might trade. It is one of many business support organizations globally. We've got about 27 chapters all around the world that supports as well as facilitates opportunities for women in trade. So we act like a bridge, like the springboard of women-owned businesses and also big organizations like WTO, ITC, She Trades. We work with big players because what our aim and goal is as well is that women's voices are heard at any platform. Trade policies might be negotiations, because this is what we are doing as a civil society. And as a global organization, we act as a connector and collaborator, but also we focus on what for women to build up, upskill them, provide capacity building, training, human skills, really hard skills. And also, as of today, what's going to happen in the trade atmosphere, sphere of what our women are looking for, because our community, our traders, our producers, our women-led businesses. And therefore, we are very happy to have Karen with us, but also Angela, who kindly facilitated the whole organization of this webinar. And with no further ado, I would like to hand over to our moderator, Angela, who is also part of Organization Women International Trade for decades. Me, it's already 10 years, so for you, it's decades. And I'm really happy to hand over to her. Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks everyone for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Angela Marshall-Hoffman, former past president of OWIT, and actually am going into my 20th year of OWIT. So exciting, because I can tell you my first OWIT meeting was when my daughter was 5 years old, or 5 days old in Washington, D.C. So great to be part of this organization. Love to have everyone joining in, and love that we have chapters now in North America, South America, UK, Geneva, all of our hotspots in Europe, and now growing very significantly in Africa. And I see lots of you on the line today, so special shout out to our colleagues who have been there for many years. So I'm also the programming chair for OWIT, and we have been conducting a series. So last year, many of you participated in our Unlocking the Power of Global Trade, the Know It, Move It, Grow It series. So how to do trade functionally. This year, there's been so many changes in politics around the world. We thought this would be our opportunity to provide an In the Know series. So we'll be talking in the know in North America, in the know on what's happening on a number of issues around logistics, in the know with DEI. We've had a whole series. You can check it out online, but this is our kickoff, and I am delighted to have my colleague Karen Antibbe, who is one of the first people when I was a starting staffer that I would call to have advice on this thing called NAFTA back in the day. Now, we're going to have a fireside chat because Karen and I have been chatting for, let's just say, about 20 years on this topic, and really about what North American trade means. Before I do that, I want to make sure, if you're online over here, a couple different things. This is off the record, not for attribution, but we really want you to ask questions. So use that Q&A function. The chat sometimes works on us, but use the Q&A for sure. And while we have you, kind of just plug in where you're calling in from. Like I said, I see several colleagues I know, but like just type in where you're calling in from, and I'm going to first read Karen's bio for you. Then we're going to get this chat started. And I know you're not shy, so we'll have time for Q&A at the end, but if you have a great question, we'll get to it as we're having the conversation. So Karen is a fantastic colleague. As I mentioned, we first met when she was working at the Embassy of Mexico, but she currently serves as the International Practice Chair at Prime Policy Group, and this is a very recognized policy institution and firm here in Washington, D.C., but you have about 2 decades of expertise, as we say, in international trade and government affairs. Karen, you built an amazing reputation as a problem solver in diplomatic and private sector areas, really sort of unlocking what's happening in policy and helping businesses, navigate what exactly they should do. And you have a great track record in building consensus, resolving these disputes and advancing business interests at the highest levels of government. So as I keep mentioning, Karen began her career as part of Mexico's NAFTA negotiating team. And so she's going to give a little bit of a scene setter on how this trade all came together. She served in both Mexico City and Washington, D.C. as a negotiator and diplomat on these policy issues. An amazing role as the chief of staff to Mexico's Deputy Secretary for International Trade, and has been involved not only in trade issues with North America, but Karen, you've been involved in a number of the bilaterals and other regional issues from the EU to Israel, Japan. Even now, I know we're having conversations about where Mexico may be expanding its reach. Also involved in lots of stakeholder engagement. I've had the pleasure of working her on areas that even helped farmers and advancing new advocacy issues. And we're going to talk about this thing called the USMCA. We've got lots of acronyms to talk about, so we're gonna do a little bit about what do these things mean. It's kind of the new NAFTA, that's the hint, and has been really instrumental in resolving disputes between our countries. So, Karen, you've got an incredible resume moving on here, but a couple words of your own on your own personal journey, because I know you've also been involved in OWIT and WIT DC. So you've been part of this community as well. So a couple words you want to say about your personal journey as a woman in trade before we get started.
Well, first, thank you so very much for having me. Angela refers to me as a colleague. I refer to her as a friend. I love her. We've known each other for quite a bit. And I think that in my journey as a woman in trade, I could not find a more supportive community than the women that are involved in international trade. And I think that that is the biggest takeaway I get. It is a wonderful environment, men included, but primarily I do have to say I've made some of the strongest friendships of incredibly smart, very resourceful, and very dedicated professionals. And I'm just delighted to be part of this group.
We love it, and definitely a dear friend. We're on speed dial, right? I think that's the thing about when you unlock the benefits. Oh, it's unlike any other networking I know. You can call trusted, trained folks who are in the know, right, about what's going on. So one of your benefits is not just being part of your chapter. Tap into your network, right? So that's what we're here about. So couldn't be a better start to today's called the In the Know series, and we're going to focus on North America. And I see we've got some friends, Susan, we've got our Canadian team here as well. But let's do a little bit of the scene setter. So in January, here in the US, President Trump, starting right out of the gate in the day 1 and day 2 and 3, issued what's sort of considered a presidential executive orders. So these are not actions from our Congress, but they are executive orders from the president. And those have varying levels of sort of advice to binding, advice to action, let's say. And several of those actions immediately targeted our trading partners in Canada and Mexico. So a lot of talk, and we're going to break down what does this mean. Before I go into those executive orders, Karen, we've got a lot of international colleagues here. And so I want to make sure that we kind of step back a moment and kind of let's talk about the landscape of North America, starting from NAFTA to USMCA. So can you kind of set the scene for us about what we're talking about, our historical and current trading relationships?
Sure, and I'll try to keep it really short and cut me off if I go too long. NAFTA, as most of you may know, was negotiated at the beginning of the 90s. And it was really about how does Mexico integrate itself to the world economy, but more importantly, a recognition that as neighbors, Mexico, the United States, and Canada could create the most competitive region in the world. And really, a powerhouse for manufacturing, for services, for innovation, for investment. And it was also a recognition that certain degree of integration was already happening among our business people. So if I were to kind of sum up what NAFTA was about creating, and it was about creating and establishing a rule-based system that provided predictability, transparency, and lowered trade barriers among the three partners. Very important for Mexico in its establishment of kind of the new, or Mexico had just joined the GATT in 1986. So this is almost 4 years later, short of 4 years later. And it went from, we had 100% tariffs on and permits needed for almost anything to fully liberalizing our economy with our largest trading partner. Now, trade has exploded between the three countries, and it was supposed to. And I remember my former deputy secretary with whom I served, in 1995, he would say, in 20 years, Mexico is going to become the United States' largest trading partner. And we were, hovering over third as the third largest trading partner. And I have to say, he's right. Luis is almost always right. And so where we are now is Mexico and Canada represent the largest trading partners, the largest exporters, the largest importers for the United States. And I think the agreement was very successful in what it was meant to do, which was increase exports or trade, increase investment in the region, and establish rules that, that were predictable, transparent, and applied across the board. We fast forward to 2016. Obviously, there are disputes, between 1994 that the agreement enters into force to 2016 when President Trump gets elected. And disputes are normal. It is like any family, if you're living and constantly interacting with somebody, given the magnitude and the intensity of the relationship, they're bound to happen. But there were mechanisms to address them. And by and large, the trade sphere remained within the trade sphere, meaning it was not contaminated by other issues within the bilateral or trilateral relationships that the United States has with its neighbors. And I know I'm very, it's kind of a very US-centric focus that I'm providing, but the reality is, between Mexico and Canada, there's this big elephant. And it is geography, and it is what we have to live with. Disputes were addressed. Sometimes we had to undertake retaliatory or countermeasures if they were not being met because of political reasons. But by and large, the agreement was meant to kind of take the politics out of the trade relationship and let businesses and companies and individuals do what they were meant to do, which is kind of grow their thing. President Trump comes in and bashes NAFTA and, withdraws the US from TPP, etc. And so then shortly, the negotiation became from, creating to preserving something. And that was pretty much what the 2016, 2018, culminating in kind of the late 2020, what the agreement was supposed to to do is how do we keep this from falling apart? And yes, there were aspects of the NAFTA that needed to be updated. The reality of things is NAFTA was negotiated in the 90s, you know. By 2016, the world had changed, and it had, you know, the huge innovation that had taken place should be addressed. The difference in the role that China was playing in the world economy had shifted, and the challenges that many of our companies and industries were facing had changed. So yes, it needed to be addressed. It needed to be updated to reflect certain realities. But at the same time, the attitude with which the United States came into the negotiation and how Mexico and Canada were motivated to respond was very different. And so we achieved a result that incorporated many new things into the agreement. There's a digital chapter. There is a gender chapter. There is, you know, obviously the labor and environmental aspects were fully incorporated into the agreement. It was groundbreaking when NAFTA was negotiated that we had those side agreements. And NAFTA was groundbreaking, and it was the first free trade agreement that really fully liberalized trade in goods between the United States and Mexico 100%. I mean, even the ag sector. So those things were groundbreaking. And what we saw in the USMCA was a bit of a clawing back of that liberalization. And now we are, again, at kind of at the threshold of uncertainty. We are, you know, the United States new government has threatened to impose tariffs on its North American neighbors, something that changed dramatically with the Trump administration in the first go round, and it's been exacerbated in this one, is the use of trade measures to address non-trade issues. So the threat of tariffs of 25% on Mexico and the United States, and the 10% applied into China for cooperation on immigration and narcotics trade is one of them. That you know, I say, you know, the US really, you know, tore the Chinese wall that used to exist, separating those issues, because you never really wanted to have a negotiation of such sensitive matters kind of interfere with the businesses and economic growth that the agreement was meant to, you know.
So Karen, let me tap on that a bit,
incentivize.
right? So when we think about trade is about the flow of goods and services, right? And so the
Correct.
rules can built around lowering tariffs, lowering non-tariff barriers, resolving disputes, focused on goods and services. And even like we saw in NAFTA, right? E-commerce didn't exist when NAFTA was written, right? Digital services did not exist, right? And those are also great opportunities for those of you who are doing cross-border digital trade through your small businesses on an e-commerce platform, right? Those are sort of the evolution of next opportunities. Karen mentioned, you know, even having a gender chapter. A lot of folks on this call around the world have been working on gender chapters and unlocking the power of trade for SMEs, for women-owned businesses, and more. So a lot of work there. But what we saw going into this year was a whole different sort of approach from the White House on trade. And to Karen's point, and I'm going to peel back a new word we are all getting our hands around. It's this thing called IEEPA, IEEPA. And it is basically an international economic power that is used to resolve things that are non-trade. So this is a power that has been everything from a threat to security or more, but now being applied to trade. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. she also mentioned some of the disputes that happened during the tools that were used during the US MCA. So that's the US, Canada, Mexico free trade agreement, or the new NAFTA. And part of that was utilizing a trade tool that was used for measures that were a threat to our national security. This was a tool that was used on our national security partners in the US, Canada. US applied threat to national security on our security partners in Europe as well, Canada, Mexico, and trading partners around the world. And I say that's important because this is a tool called 232. And I'm going to bring this up because 232 is back, and that is part of our discussion as well. So a couple of things, let's talk a little bit about this IEEPA, Karen, just to help, again, further frame we are moving from trade to tariffs being utilized not for the trade mechanism, but tariffs to solve other things. So can you share a little bit about what's going on with IEEPA? Because we're all trying to learn this one.
Right. So I think you're absolutely right, Angela. And you know, what the Trump administration discovered in the last go around and is moving fast and furiously on this one is there are a number of instruments and laws that the president has to adopt measures under the national security guise, and they are difficult to challenge. IEEPA, as Angela says, it's the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. It is the US government is facing a crisis, and hence I have to respond. I think the last time that it was used was somewhat related to or as close as we can get related to trade, was like in the mid-70s, and it was related to an oil embargo. So that's just hugely different than saying I'm not seeing the cooperation that I want from my trading partners, so I am going to take a unilateral measure and apply a tariff on their goods. It has never been used. It was threatened in 2019. Seem to recall it was around May 30th. The threat lasted about 5 days, and then it was withdrawn, and it was against Mexico, and it was again over the immigration flows. The fact of the matter is that Mexico cooperates deeply on immigration. The fact of the matter is that there was strong bilateral cooperation on multiple fronts, but politics sometimes trumps policy, right? This time around, I feel that what we've seen so far is a hesitancy of many in the United States government, Congress, some businesses, to really call it out. And part of it is out of fear of having experienced the Trump 1 administration. Nobody wants to get caught in the tweet storm and in the exposure that the president can bring. Part of it is, let's see what don't focus so much on what he says, let's focus on what he does. But the reality of things is that the sword of Damocles over the North American partners is there, and it's not going away. So the tariff threats are real, should be perceived as real, and companies need to take them seriously. They should look at what their supply chains are. They really should know where are they sourcing from, and make sure, that they have a firm understanding of what they're importing and from which countries and what the origin of that good is. Because as we've seen, the US is also changing its rules in terms of giving the Department of Commerce more flexibilities on how you adopt and interpret unfair trade practices, meaning subsidies and anti-dumping, and the interpretation of origin and the interpretation of transnational subsidies. So it's really important that companies know that. The other thing that I would advise many, well, everybody, is plan. Plan for your worst case scenario. Plan about what is the potential impact if it goes across the board to 25%, which, look, I'm in Mexico City right now. It is very, very concerning here. The across the board tariffs, of course, but also the other measure that Angela mentioned, which is the 232. That's a different instrument that the president has to apply tariffs. So let me just differentiate really quickly between IEEPA and a 232. IEEPA, as I said, is an executive power that the president has to adopt measures. It has never been used. It has not been contested in terms of trade. If it happens, we could anticipate that there will be legal challenges to it, but we're not sure where the courts would fall because there is a high degree of deference that the courts give to the president when it comes to foreign relations.
Karen, can I ask a question to that one?
Yes.
But we're hearing too, again, we've got colleagues on Canada and Mexico that Canada and Mexico have responded that they would impose countermeasures.
Yes. So that
Tell us
is
more about that.
So I think, everybody and every conversation that has taken place at the highest level is the USMCA partners, Mexico and Canada, say, we don't want this. What do we need to do in order to avoid this? Let's talk, let's negotiate, let's find common ground. So there's a little bit here and there, but as I say, the threat remains. What recourse do countries have when faced with such a threat? So you're putting a gun to my head, I'll put one to yours. So we end up in this very perverse prisoner's dilemma, I think, where if it happens, we're both in the worst case scenario, right? Because you adopt tariffs on my exports or imports coming from me, from Mexico or Canada, which already increases the cost of manufacturing on whatever those are. And the countermeasures or retaliatory tariffs, we like to call them countermeasures so that it is not kind of vindictive, have a cost. And when you're highly integrated, you need to be very careful about what you're picking to kind of respond to those threats. So when I did the countermeasures retaliation list on the cross-border trucking dispute between Mexico and the United States, we had very strict parameters through which we developed that list. And I feel Canada and Mexico have continued to look at it under the lens of what measures can I take that will influence decision makers or those individuals who can influence those decision makers. So which members of Congress, what states, who has the president's ear? How do I motivate that change? The other thing is, how do I, when I'm developing this retaliation list, can I have substitute products or can I source from other FTA partners? Now, Mexico and Canada have the benefit of having a wide network of free trade agreements. So that's another condition. And the third, and they're all equally important, right? It's like this three-legged stool is, how do I ensure that it does not create inflationary pressures at home? So you have to be very selective in what you're picking. Now, the magnitude of a 25% across the board tariff is huge. It's also, for many of us, think it can't be real, right? Because there are many things that the US is very dependent on Mexico and Canada. And the reality is that where are they going to source it from? I mean, the US has a huge dependent on energy from Canada. And it would, as much as they would like to be energy independent, it doesn't make sense. I mean, are you going to freeze people in Maine for whatever it takes you to develop that just because that there's a policy? Or, I mean, I can get really technical, but there's a chemical called fluor that's used in multiple things, and Mexico is the sole provider for some reason. So all of a sudden you're going to eliminate this from the manufacturing. So it doesn't seem real, but at the same time, we know that the president is not necessarily thinking of this through a rational, logical lens.
And so I'm going to pull that thread a little bit more and kind of talk about next steps. So what we saw, the IEEPA tariffs were announced in February, and kind of we came to a deal over the weekend. There was a lot of work with the leaders from all three countries, announcements on partnerships around border security and immigration and fentanyl, that was the target, right? China's did go into effect, but Canada and Mexico got sort of a 30-day reprieve, which is coming up, I believe, this weekend, if I can look at my
Sure.
calendar. Now there is a possibility, right, that those issues could potentially be resolved. Potentially. We also have now the new tariffs, though, that are related to steel and aluminum. So remember, we talked about the tariff dispute in the past. That's another 25% and another 15%. So
No,
I mean,
25 and 25.
25 and 25, right? Before it was 25 and 15, now it's 20,
Right, now
25
it's
and
25
25.
and 25.
And these are all products, all
On
categories
steel
on steel,
and aluminum, yes, not across
on
the
steel and
board.
aluminum, that trickle down to even the parts and pieces and components, right? So if you're sourcing from a group, you might need to look at the content of these items too. Again, this would be unheard of because typically there's a study involved to determine where and how those should be applied. And in the past, we were able to secure an exclusion process, right? Where certain items, certain products would not be impacted. So there's a lot to sort of look at in this time frame right now. Karen, I believe the steel and aluminum are due mid-March. So there's a lot that is sort of discussing about, again, what is the way forward for North America? I also sense, so there's a lot of discussion about maybe we also need to find other friends in other communities and deepen other ties. So Karen, I know you've been working very, very closely over the years with, discussions on Europe and more, Canada and Mexico are both part of the CPTPP, the regional agreement that the US stepped away from. We're seeing visits from Prime Minister Modi from India. What could that relationship look for? So it feels like maybe how are we trying to, from a North America perspective, extend our economic relationships beyond? Could you share a little bit about how, maybe some of that, not reframing, but just expanding to sort
Look,
of
I mean,
economic allies list is looking?
you're absolutely right. The 232, which is again another national security instrument that requires, so where the first one, the IEEPA, is just a presidential prerogative, 232 requires an investigation. The investigation was conducted in 2018. And it resulted in the first round of tariffs against steel and aluminum imports, in which Mexico, Canada, the EU, Japan, South Korea, etc., a whole number of countries, announced that they were going to adopt retaliatory measures. Some of them did, some of them didn't. Mexico and Canada negotiated exclusions, and so those kind of never really went into force, but the lists were there. This, and yes, that one had product exclusions. So if there was a short supply, meaning you couldn't source it in the United States, if it was essential for whatever, criteria, those process was highly criticized by Congress because it was perceived as being very, it lacked transparency. And so, at least in this first announcement, the Trump administration has said they're coming into force. There's no exclusions, full stop, period. And we're expanding it to downstream products, which is, you know, the hooks and the needles and the whole thing. It's goods that are, I believe, in chapters 73, 74, and 76 of the tariff of the HTS system. Countries have to be ready for that. Companies have to be ready for that. I believe that they will enter into force in March 12th. And I also believe that while they say no exclusions, mean no product specific, they're going to have to give themselves some room. And Commerce, the Department of Commerce has said, come talk to us. We want to hear how this is going to affect you. This, you know, I think it's important that companies go and talk to them. I also have to, you know, caution them that whatever you say can and may be used against you in future negotiations. So just be very, you know, you have to have a very clear message about what you're asking and how. No exclusions, maybe exemptions. So are countries going to negotiate their way out of this applying to them? And what is that? What is the president looking in return for? I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. I would assume that they're going to be, you know, it's about investments in the US. It is about monitoring systems. It is about, you know, kind of limiting Chinese everything into your economies. And so those are the things that I could kind of deduce. And if you're not a country with a deficit, kind of like Australia, and if you are a country that, you know, are essential to certain national security interests that the president does consider relevant, and Australia for where it is in the world, and does not have a trade deficit with the US, neither on those sector specific, nor writ large, then you might have an exclusion. I don't know if that answered your question. And you're on mute. Angela, you're on mute.
It does. I'm going to figure out that mute button. It's only been several years now. It does, but you know what? Ask more questions. And I'm sure all of you online, and if you have your questions, start putting them in the chat box, because again, wait a minute, we're using trade agreements to solve other things, right? We're things that
Yeah, I
aren't
mean, look,
typically in the trade
tariffs
sphere.
are at the centerpiece of his philosophy. And they are contradictory, I mean, for what he wants to achieve. So we're talking, you know, we've talked about national security on the one hand. He's also talked about them as a revenue raiser. This is going to generate revenue for the US under the false impression that it is the
Importer of record.
exporter or the country of origin that will be paying for these. The tariffs are paid by the importer. Now, whether that gets transferred, you know, from, I mean, the exporter can either just transfer it to the importer, or the exporter chooses to eat it up and lower the price, is a separate question. There are countries that can do that. China is very effective at kind of like absorbing, but many can't. And in other industries, the margins are so small that it's just not sustainable. I mean, again, I take it to the energy example in Maine, where, you know, the member of Congress received a letter from the utility company saying, look, if these tariffs go into place, even a 10% energy, you know, increase in energy from Canada to my state is going to be directly impacting my consumers, because the utility, because I can't absorb it. And the prices are going to have to go up by at least 5%. So those things are happening. So revenue raiser, he also sees them as a means to address, you know, imbalances, trade deficits, and other imbalances. So they're punitive, but also, do they really level a playing field? And can they address the deficit? No, because if you make it more expensive to export, then you're appreciating the currency. So de facto, the exporting country can't import more. So you can't, so it raises the value of the US currency, if I can say it in such layman terms. So the deficit is not going to be solved. It's actually more likely going to widen. And then the one where we were just talking about, which is, can we motivate reshoring of supply chains and domestic manufacturing, which is a lot behind the aluminum and steel. It requires much more than a stick, right?
So I'm going to come back to sort of how we tee this up, right? So North America is a trading bloc powerhouse, unlike no other. These are three economies that are fundamentally not just integrated, but dependent on one another. And until recent years, we've had our squabbles, we've had our family squabbles, we've had ways to resolve them. But by and large, under the USMCA, we had a path forward on the renewal of the USMCA. But what we're seeing, I believe, is, again, our trade mechanisms being utilized as negotiating bargaining chips for other issues. So I'm going to come back on here, and I'm going to try to put sometimes from chaos and confusion, there's opportunity. So we have a lot of, folks on this line who may be trading from other countries. What do you see as we're sort of thinking through both sort of from companies and providers playing a little bit of defense? You've talked a lot about, prepare for the worst and walk backwards. What are some of the areas, though, you think that look forward, Cascade, if we wanted to see the ultimate positive outcome? And I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I'm an eternal optimist, Karen. We've been at this for a very long time. Where do you see maybe some of the opportunities for collaboration result in a success? So we get our powerhouse trading bloc back together.
I love it.
It's not a trick question.
No, I understand that it is not a trick question. Look, I do not want to be pessimistic, but I do feel that the President Trump comes with a very different worldview, and philosophy, and it is not only manifesting in the trade sphere, it's manifesting in its foreign policy and in its domestic policy. So I think, part of me wants to say, let's wait and see what 2026 happens and what the politics are. Are there going to be members in Congress? Will there be a sufficient a critical mass of people that are going to want to kind of reestablish kind of the US leadership or benign leadership in the world? Or are we really destined to a, mercantilist era, which will eventually end? Opportunities. Clearly there are opportunities. I think that it, for Canada and for Mexico to look at other trading partners and deepen those relationships. I think that is super important. That a lot of the work that needs to be done domestically, they can be undertaken and not have it be motivated by the integration process or by the agreement. So in Mexico, I would say, for example, the infrastructure development, the rule of law, the certain areas that are very specific. But in Canada, it could be more about how do you deregulate and eliminate like the barriers across provinces, which hinders their own kind of economic growth. So those are areas of opportunity. I also feel that, continued close cooperation between Mexico and Canada is essential to countering this, but also with the European Union. I mean, we're talking about the steel and aluminum tariffs. I read a couple of days ago, that's about a $30 billion hit on trade with the EU. which is 4 times what it was in the first go round. And then I have the Mexico paper here, which has it on the front page of their business section, and it's about the same amount. So as you know, countries should look to negotiate, should have objectives in mind, but should also defend their interests. And kind of what the trick here is, you know, these trade wars, as I said a couple of minutes ago, is that they benefit no one. We all end up poorer, but also it has this contagion effect, right? You hit me, so I have to respond, and so we become more isolated. So then I adopt similar measures, and so then we really are not in a path towards creation, but more about isolation. Sorry, it was not the optimistic response.
But
Angela,
go ahead, Julia. And I think we also have a question in the box, right?
exactly. That's what I
Mhm.
wanted to actually say because we've got only 10 minutes
Yep.
left. And that's from Susan, Canada. What is your take on the effect of the trade tariffs and of the DEI procurement program cuts on women exporters in North America?
If you're doing it between the United States, between Canada and Mexico, that's going to be fine. I would not, yeah. This is going to be a very tricky area. As I said, the restructuring and refocus of the domestic policy in the US is as profound as it is in the trade and foreign policy space. I would kind of give it a couple of months to try to see where things are shaking out, because it's still early days. There's still court challenges, but I would not base my business on it, at least not right now.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
But nevertheless, this group will continue to push opportunities for women in international trade. The rest of the
Absolutely.
world is wide
Yep.
open for business.
And the network that this group provides makes it, you know, it is much more than the government policies. And you know, together we are much stronger.
Agree. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that support that we have in our circle, which is really wide and vast, as civil society, as someone who supports as well women in trade, is, and what shall I say? It's just powerful. Just powerful. That's it. You know, and as you say, it's more than just the policies. It's really based on trust, on collaboration, because the new competition is collaboration, and we work together and we see how we can support each other. And that is beyond anything else.
Well,
Absolutely. And, you know, we saw this as well at our last fall board meeting in Geneva, right? The WTO has a large inclusion program as well. We have our Geneva-based colleagues. Julia, I believe you are headed to the UK, right? This
Yeah.
week as well. So this work and very important vital work is continuing, which is pretty exciting. I know we are just about at a wrap up, Julia, with questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Julia to see if you have additional questions or insights from this team, or if we have any more in the chat box.
In the chat box, we don't have anything else. It's not the chat box, it's the Q&A. People asked me, first of all, because the chat box is disabled. But thanks so much for these candid answers, Karen, because it's frightening what we see at the moment, what's happening over there. I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland, origin Turkish. And if I hear, see, and read all the news, you are, as you were saying rightly, the new administration is in trade war for whatever reason. They have their legitimate, of course, reasons, I'm sure, but it creates uncertainty. It creates that world view not to do any business anymore and wait. because then we are getting into the stagnation of business and trade because we don't know where we are heading. And that's what people then do, and traders do, and women-led businesses as well, and even women-led businesses more so are more cautious. We're not that, we don't take so much risk, right? We tend to see, measure, and wait until we can see a bit the light of the tunnel, where we are heading, what will be the destination. So how would you see that then, Karen? How would that have an impact on women-led businesses doing trade with North America?
I think, separate things. The administration is just forming itself, and so we're going to park the politics for a little bit.
Mhm.
I guess
Good
the
advice.
difference
I like that.
between
Park the politics, right?
policy, foreign policy, is one where by opening your mouth, you pretty much made policy. Whereas in everything else, it requires, certain actions and processes and there are rules and laws and procedures that are in place and have been in place for a long time. And contractual agreements within and with the US companies, those are still sacrosanct. And I do believe that the US is still a rule-based country. So companies engaging in business and business operations in the United States should continue to do business with them. And should continue to look for opportunities, and likewise, US companies that are engaging outside should continue to do that because it's part of because it is what we do. I mean, and it is not only because we do it, but because we want to do it, right? And it provides value, and it makes everybody, better. So that's definite. The other part of it is, as I said earlier, is know your supply chain. Know where the origin of your inputs are coming from. Look for alternatives. Nobody can switch a supply chain overnight, that's for sure. But you might discover the untapped markets or places where you didn't know that there was actually an opportunity. Rely on this network. Talk with each other, kind of share experiences. Ask, hey, is anybody interested in my widgets? Or do you know if somebody, I want to buy this or need that? Rely on your network. Networks are wonderful. I have 2 children, and they're both kind of pretty intelligent beings. But what I tell them is it's more important, to be kind and to kind of cultivate your networks than what you know, than your smarts, because everything else you're going to be able to figure it out. But people generally, they want to help.
Yeah.
So I'll leave on that
Thank you.
positive note.
Absolutely. And I believe on that. I believe strongly on networking, because this is the #1 business rule, which is not really spoken, doesn't exist in any kind of policy, but it's so much impactful. Whom you know, where you know, how to get resource, how to get information, whom to ask, as you rightly say. An organization, Women International Trade, is this big sisterhood that we have, this big circle. I say sisterhood because we've got more women like men, but we are inclusive, as we said already in the beginning. With no further ado, I hand over to Angela to do the closure, because I checked as well quickly the Q&A box. I don't see any other new question. So with no further ado, Angela, you can actually slowly but surely close the floor, I guess.
Thanks, Julia. Well, first I want to thank Karen for joining us today. We started this series about in the know, right? It's about who do you pick up the phone and say, what's going on? How do we navigate this? And that's really what cultivated this series, is having the opportunity for OWIT globally to ask the tough questions and let's get a better understanding, not to be surprised and shocked about trade, but to be ready and to understand and to adapt and be resilient, right, in your businesses, whether you're product provider, where either you're a service provider, the more you know, the more you can adapt, plan, again, not only be resilient, but we hope thrive. So check into our line. The In the Know series is going to be the last Thursday of every month. We have a whole series coming up. Also, we welcome new topics because, it seems like this year, every day, there's a new topic that we maybe could be talking about. If you are interested or even a subject matter expert and want to be part of those series, give me a call too as well. So I'm at vp@owit.org. So again, empowering everyone to understand what's happening in our world, navigating challenging times, and at the end, we hope we all thrive. So Julia, last word on here. Thanks for your leadership and presidency, bringing us all together. And thanks for everyone participating today.
And just
Thank-
one thing, Julia and Angela, feel free to give them my cell. I'm on WhatsApp or my email. Contact me directly, just kind of reference, hey, I'm Owit, I need this. I'm good at
And
getting things done.
Karen and her organization, that's what they do. They are in the business of helping you navigate. So crime policy is one of the leading forces here in Washington, and Karen, you are based in multiple locations. So this is exactly in the wheelhouse. So don't be surprised, don't be shy. Get in there and learn what's going on.
Thank you so much for sharing, Karen, and for generosity of your time and your knowledge. And thanks for organizing, Angela, and creating this wonderful pipeline of events that we're going to look for in the know. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Ciao.
you.